In the world between worlds, all we have is the void. To some, the void might feel personal and close. It's the stuff of sleepless nights and ghosts from the past that keep haunting us. The looming presence of anxiety, depression, and addiction. Others, when they look into the void, see the suffering of the world. Climate collapse, social injustice, inequality, and oppression. The loss of virtue and wisdom from the past, or existential risks and stagnation. Like a strange monster with many names and many faces, the void shifts from person to person, taking the shape of that which we fear most. To me, despite the darkness, I still sense light on the other side. A question kept coming up. If life can sometimes be so amazing, so bright, and if most of us are actually pro-social and would like to see a world where everyone thrives, then why is it that we've ended up here? And so, I made it my mission to look deep into the void. What does the void hide? What lies on the other side? And what I found was really surprising, because at the other side of the void, there isn't death or darkness. There wasn't some ugly secret about the true nature of humanity that we try to bury down, a scary truth that no one dares speak about. Instead, what I found was the opposite. The void isn't even dark. It's actually colorful, bright, and full of life, and it's only that it turns dark when we disconnect from that essence of life. This is a story about why the light often goes dark, and what can we do to claim it back, both in our personal lives and in the systems that shape us. But more importantly, it's about building a future where this light always shines bright. Now, this might still feel very abstract, so I want to start with a little exercise to help us get in touch with that light. Okay, so if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes, and I'm going to ask you to think back to one of the most meaningful moments that you've had in your life. Try to really tune in into the feelings of how you felt at the time. What were you paying attention to? Which sort of way of living felt possible? What was it that made this moment so meaningful, so special? Try to go really deep into this feeling, and once you have it, we're going to do this again. Now, try to think back to one of the most meaningful moments that you've experienced in this past year. Try to really tune in into the feelings of how you felt at the time. What were you paying attention to? What was it that made this moment so special and beautiful? Which way of living felt possible? Which new world felt possible? Try to go really deep into that feeling, and once you have it, we will do this one more time. Now, let's think back to one of the most meaningful moments that you've experienced in the past week. It doesn't need to be an especially happy moment. It can even be a hard or even challenging experience that you've had. Sometimes we take a lot of meaning from difficult experiences. But whatever you choose, try to go really deep into that feeling and try to tune in into what was it that made this feeling feel so special. What made it be so meaningful, so relevant? Try to go really deep into the feeling, and once you have it, you can open up your eyes again. Now, these moments might have been very different from each other, but what they have in common is that they were attuned to a way of living that feels deeply relevant to us. They tap into a very fundamental source of life that is what I like to call the sacred. Now, under my definition, the sacred is not a static characteristic that some things represent because an authority said so, but rather the underlying quality that all these feelings have in common. It's the quality of connectedness and relevance, beauty and meaning. But that quality can manifest in many different ways. Sometimes in the feeling of fulfillment and empowerment that we get after accomplishing a great challenge. Other times in the ordinary joys of life, after a good night with our squad, admiring a well-placed ray of light, or when we just simply listen to the right song at the right time and we feel grateful of being alive. We might feel it when we marvel at the infinite beauty and wisdom of life, no matter whether for us it shows up in nature, in art, or in the traditions of our past. We may feel it in the feeling of solidarity that we get when we help a stranger out, or when we devote ourselves to a common cause. Other times, when we're pushing for the boundaries of what humanity is capable of, whether it's by expanding the frontier of knowledge or by reaching for the stars. We can find it in our sweetest, purest essence, like in the love that a mother has for her child. But other times, it manifests in a darker, spicier way, like when you let yourself go wild in a dark techno night. These different manifestations of the sacred are what we call values, or sources of meaning. To me, they represent the compass of consciousness orienting us towards what's important, the universe of meaning expressed in all its creativity and range. Now, if we were to think about what constitutes a good life, this would be, in many ways, a life that is truly aligned with our sources of meaning. And by this, I don't just mean it in this purely hedonistic fake happiness sort of way, but in a way that still challenges us and makes us grow into the person that we truly want to become. Now, in order to experience our sources of meaning, we need containers. Containers are the vehicle, meaning the space, the group, the practice, the object, the story, through which we express and practice a value. For example, the value of togetherness, that feeling of being part of a group with whom I share common values and feel supported by. We can find it in the army, or in a football club, or in a protest, a local political party, or in a rave. And the value of transcendence, that feeling of being deeply connected to a reality much bigger than yourself, can be found in a traditional setting of a church, or you might find it in nature, in deep meditation, through tantric sex, or with the right combination of drugs. Now, containers are great because they allow us to experience a source of meaning in many different forms and shapes. We need containers to navigate through life. However, with containers comes a problem. We tend to over-identify with the container and lose the meaning. For example, all religions start out by having important insights into the source of the sacred. Insights that later get codified into a set of precepts or social norms that are meant to help you live in connection to that sacredness. And at smaller scales, it's very easy for religions to maintain a clear and direct connection to those original insights. However, as they grow and time passes, it's very easy for these values to get obscured by the doctrine, and the interpretation of the doctrine, and the interpretation of the interpretation of the doctrine, which leads to all forms of institutional decay and social dysfunction that has very little to do with the sources of meaning that the religion was initially based on. And you'd be forgiven to think that that's just the natural workings of religion, with dogma and fanaticism baked into it by design. But no, the exact same thing happens with all ideologies. Let's analyze what happened with our dominant ideology, liberalism, or more broadly, what went wrong with modernity. Liberalism started out as a reaction to religious dogma. Men don't need strong moral stories to tell them how they ought to live. They are rational individuals who know themselves what is actually best for them, so they should be free to pursue happiness on their own terms. And at the time, this mostly meant being able to own and work on your own land, read whichever books you want to read from the public library, say whatever you want in the public square, and finally come together and vote. This was the first era of liberalism that revolved mainly around what we call household goals. And as the Industrial Revolution kept paying off, those household goals grew to include not only farm work, but also being able to acquire all these new functional appliances that you needed in order to participate in modern society. But later, things took another turn. At some point, marketers realized that you could sell people more stuff if you didn't cater to a direct need that they have, but rather a way to express who you truly are. And with this, another form of liberalism came up. One in which being free to pursue happiness on your own terms didn't just mean living by your goals, but being able to self-express yourself through your consumption choices. And since people have many different tastes, we have to cater to all of them with different variations of the same products. This is what we call long-tailed preference liberalism, and is what gave us shopping malls, brands, and lifestyle consumerism with well-defined consumer niches. But then, with the rise of the internet and social media, things took another, even darker turn. Here, satisfying people's tastes or preferences didn't just mean hooking up people with the right product or brand. Instead, since every action that you take online can be analyzed in extreme detail by powerful algorithms, your preferences can now be derived not just from the things you buy, but from whatever you click on, view, and like. So, if you look at this instant model for 0.4 seconds more, point taken, now your feed will be forever full of them. Ended up in a weird porn category? Then get ready for an algorithmically induced perversion journey. And if clickbait incendiary content is what drives most engagement, well, who are we to silence the digital public square? And this is how the initial ideas that liberalism wanted to promote, letting people pursue happiness on their own terms so that they can flourish in their own unique way, have integrated into a very different thing. A world full of consumerism, polarization, and addiction. And if you couple these with exponential tech that works 24/7 to pump up those trends, well, the story tells itself. Now, what is going on? Why is it that meaning degrades so much with time and scale? I believe it's because of a process of distortion that makes meaning get lost to containers. The reason for this is that it's very hard for us to properly articulate, measure, and keep track of meaning. Of course, it's much easier to measure follows and likes than if people are getting actual community or creative expression. It's much easier to assess whether someone shows up for church and says they're a Christian, rather than if they're actually living in alignment with the love of Christ. This lack of articulacy is what makes meaning so hard to defend against perverse incentives, and the reason why we often end up creating systems that optimize for the wrong thing. Systems that mistake the quality of sacredness for the container itself. It's also the reason why the world today feels so full of bullshit, because with each new layer of over-identification with containers, we lose signal and truth to empty ritual and performance. We end up with systems where education is confused with credentials, self-improvement with checking boxes in an app, and establishing real relationships with follows, swaps, and likes. Systems that leave everyone dissatisfied. And it's this process of the distortion of meaning that makes the void gradually dim its light. And it gets worse, because this process also exacerbates ideological conflict and political polarization, which, in turn, makes it much harder for us to be able to address the problems we face. For example, let's look at these two groups of people. On one hand, we have Trump supporters, and on the other hand, social justice activists. Now, in our current climate, the mere mention of one group to the other is enough to set off a rage rampage. It's impossible to imagine them having a normal conversation, and much less coordinating together to solve big problems. This is why it feels like the only way to get what you want, to really be able to live the way that you want to live, is by fighting the other side and gaining power over them. I believe a big part of what's driving this dynamic is that we're over-identifying with their container, whether that's their political party, social identity, or the policies that they stand behind. Now, I'm not saying that this conflict is entirely made up, or that containers are simply arbitrary labels that we could easily let go of. No, the truth is that containers always stand for certain sources of meaning. And, in this case, behind Trump supporters, we can probably find values like caring about life in overlooked small communities, what's known as small-town America, or honoring the dignity of blue-collar values, or protecting those in my immediate community. And behind social justice activists, we can probably find values like honoring the wisdom of diverse voices and experiences, or caring for marginalized small communities, or creating spaces that let people show up as their full, authentic selves. Now, I believe that if we were able to get articulate about meaning, we'd find that sometimes some of the values might be more compatible than what it initially seems like. For example, these two groups seem to both care about making space for voices outside of the mainstream and caring for overlooked communities. But the thing about emphasizing meaning instead of containers is that even when you don't share them, they are much easier to empathize with. On the other hand, when the conversation is entirely fixated on containers, not only we become much more polarized, but end up in a situation where no one across the political spectrum actually feels seen or understood. Because behind every container, no matter how outrageous it might seem at first, there is always a kernel of truth. So imagine, how different would the conversation be if we were focused on meaning? Of course, it wouldn't mean that we'd suddenly agree on everything, because conflict is an inherent part of life. However, we'd be able to see each other in a very different light, one that emphasizes our shared humanity and quest for meaning. And with this, I believe we'd experience a renewed sense of social trust, in a way that even when there's conflict, even when there's disagreements, it would still be much easier for us to understand each other and find creative solutions to our challenges. Now, of course, none of what I'm talking about is exactly a no problem. The truth is that we've never had completely values-aligned, bullshit-free ideologies, and over-identification with containers is a problem as old as time. So this hasn't changed. What is new then is how high the stakes are now. Because our civilization has become enormously powerful, with more and more aspects of our society being run by increasingly powerful technologies. Technologies that are all trying to optimize for something: engagement, consumption, profit. And so, no matter whether we're talking about the algorithms that run teenage social media or the mechanisms behind complex financial systems, today, any misalignment with our values is already being exponentially magnified. No wonder why the void suddenly seems so dark. And this is why the question of what's good, what should we optimize for, matters now more than ever. Because, as it's often said, if we want the power of the gods, we also need the wisdom of the gods. So, what signal do we want to amplify? Will we amplify systems designed for the most shallow or the most beautiful part of ourselves? Do we want a world that optimizes for paperclips or one that optimizes for meaning? The void might feel scary, but it's a very fertile place to be, because when things are dark, it means that they've already been gray for a long time. And sometimes, it's only when we're directly confronted with the darkness that we get the courage to reconnect with the sacred. And to aid us in this process, we created a special tool, a torch to guide us in the darkness. This tool is nothing short of a superpower, at least as far as human skills go. It's like a very powerful and very sophisticated bullshit detector. Like some sort of special glasses that if you put them on, they allow you to see straight through the fog of the void. What this power does is that it grants us the capacity to put into words the essence of the sacred. It allows us to speak about meaning not in these vague one-word terms that corporate boards use as decoration, but rather in a way that allows us to very specifically point out to the ultimate thing, the ultimate quality that really matters to us, with the refinement of a sommelier talking about the delicate notes in wine, or how a painter can distinguish between the subtleties of color. And why is this such a big deal? Well, because we can only create the realities we can name. You've probably had this experience before, when you discover a new concept and it appears to suddenly pop out everywhere in a way that it illuminates a new understanding of the world and how you interact with it. Well, with values articulacy, we learn to see the world through the lenses of what's most meaningful to us, in a way where it becomes much easier to distinguish between meaning and containers. At a personal level, this allows us to tell meaning apart from social norms, whatever the world tells us that we should want or do, so that we get much more clarity on the things that actually matter to us, what we feel our purpose to be, the types of relationships we want to have, environments we thrive in, this giving us a renewed sense of agency and direction in life. But this isn't just useful at the personal level, because when we apply these lenses to the systems that we're in, it allows us to discover a hidden world of meaning. For example, today, when we think about democracy, we often think about it in its most shallow expression, as simply the act of throwing a paper in a ballot every 4 years. But if we were able to articulate the meaning behind it properly, we could see that it's actually made up of values like the faith in people that comes when new wisdom and insights emerge from people deliberating on important civic and moral questions, or the sense of democratic entrepreneurial action that comes when people actively engage and take action in the shaping of their communities. Or perhaps it's the inverse elitism that comes from the respect for the local knowledge of ground communities and the careful awareness of the limits of the perspective of leaders and the dangers of elite isolation. So imagine, how would our understanding and practice of democracy change if instead of measuring how many people turn up to vote, we were measuring for those other values instead? Or how would our world change if this capacity to be articulate about meaning was as widespread as the capacity we have to think about our goals and preferences? Not only this, imagine if it was common sense to understand humans in those terms, as people who have sources of meaning that they want to live by, rather than soulless automatons that need to be manipulated for incentives in order to get things done. I believe a radical new world of possibility would open up, in the same way that the understanding of humans as rational, utility-maximizing individuals opened the door to envisioning and creating the institutions that shape the modern age, like markets and democracies. And this is where the important part comes. Because once we're meaning articulate, it's time to redesign the world around what's most precious to us. Think about your job. How would your product or service change if it was trying to honor the sources of meaning of the people that you're trying to serve? And if we zoom out, how would the market change if everyone did the same? Or think about your time in school and try to picture how different would that have been if it had been designed around you and your classmates' sources of meaning. Or imagine how much creativity, innovation, and beauty we could unlock if the leading institutions in science and the art world encouraged wild curiosity and experimentation instead of accumulating the right takes on the current thing. Or how would it feel to know that AI really is on our side because it actually understands what our sources of meaning are and only works in service to what's meaningful for us? But don't stop here. Imagine even more. In a world built around meaning, how would our own lives change? How would our sense of identity and ways of relating with each other change if, instead of thinking of ourselves as our job titles or consumers of certain lifestyles, oppressors or oppressed, we defined ourselves by the things that are most meaningful to us? And now stop imagining, because what I'm describing is not a utopia or a faraway dream, but a reality that's already here. This change has already started, and there's already hundreds of people working towards a world like this. Perhaps you're one of them too. What we want is to accelerate this work that's already being done with a few innovations. Innovations that can help us ensure that meaning doesn't get lost to bad containers, that the void doesn't turn dark. The first innovation is about designing for meaning. It's about developing surveys, metrics, and tools that show when people's lives are richly meaningful, or in which cases meaning degrades. These metrics can inform new ways of designing things, organizations, apps, community structures, to stay meaningful, and to redesign them when the meaning fades. This is what Joe's talk is about, so if you're curious about that, go check it out. The second innovation has to do with using AI to help align society with meaning. We're doing this by using trained language models to help people articulate their sources of meaning, and from that, building recommender systems that help people connect with whatever they need to live their most meaningful life. These innovations constitute the basis for our vision of helping replace the consumption and attention economies with an economy of meaning. But they also help pave the way for a third innovation, an innovation of a different kind, but of equal power. I'm talking about a new social vision, a new cultural myth or story about our lives, identities, and how we all fit together in this new meaning-centric world. A vision that can inspire new communities, practices, and rituals that help us realize and stay in touch with this new story. But ours is a very different movement than most of the ones we've been used to. Why? Well, because most movements today are what I call death cults. Movements that are driven by the fear of the void rather than revealing the beauty behind it. You can see this in their message, which is always something like this. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this non-stop? You see, no matter whether it's climate change, social injustice, tech hijacking our mind, or AI risk, we've normalized that the enlightened thing to do is to spread fear and guilt. And hey, I get it. I'm by no means oblivious to the problems facing the world. But here's the thing. While it's true that some of this is needed in order to see what's gone wrong, this endless stream of criticism and fear-mongering is simply not the energy or the messaging that works in order to construct towards something good. Because if we're only focused on solving problems, but don't have a beautiful vision of a future that's worth fighting for, we might win battles, but we'll still lose the war. But also, because here's the thing, if your movement is built on this, well, then no wonder that this is what it's doing to your people. Again, why is it that we've normalized that most of the movements trying to change the world and do good are actually breaking such earnest, well-hearted, and often young people? Is this really the place from which we want to build the future? And finally, the aesthetics. Oh god, the aesthetics. This is a very sad trend that is actually not just in movement building, it's everywhere. And you could think that this aesthetic tragedy is simply because people have bad taste or because we have lost the capacity for aesthetic appreciation. But no, don't let yourself be fooled. This is because we've been mediocrity pilled by utilitarianism. Because when your philosophy is driven by suffering, the fear of the void, you disconnect yourself from the fact that beauty and goodness are not in opposition, but rather they are two sides of the same coin, the source of our moral intuitions that orient us towards what's good. But if you disconnect from that fundamental truth, you'll end up creating a world of fake, shallow beauty and sterile, lifeless utility. And this is how we've ended up like this. Now, I want to change this. I really, really want to change this. And not only because this is not the right way to build a better future, but also because we deserve better. Because if you can't build a beautiful movement, you can't build a beautiful world. So here's what we're doing. Instead of gloom and doom, our movement is going to be founded on an apparently simple but very powerful principle: to help each other discover and bring to the world that which is most meaningful to us. I like this principle because it's anti-ideological. It doesn't presuppose that there is one right thing that everyone should do and that we should rile up everyone to, and you're either on our team or against. Meaning, being so diverse is a beautiful thing. It's what makes our world so vibrant and so rich. But this doesn't mean being relativistic or nihilistic. It's not about anything goes or doing whatever the fuck we want. No, beauty and goodness are real. Meaning is real and very much worth pursuing. It's just that it takes a little bit more effort, a little bit more reflection, to figure out exactly what these mean to you, instead of simply accepting other people's definitions. But there's another reason for why I like this principle so much. And it's because the thing that it puts at the center is not some sort of abstract, distant ideal, but rather the magical quality that all these beautiful moments and experiences have in common. Because this is something that we've all felt, even if it's only once. We've all felt those moments where we get a glimpse of something different, something beautiful, something true. And you see, for me, the biggest tragedy of humanity is not Moloch with its misaligned incentives, the original sin that's making us evil, not even the Buddhist universal suffering. No, for me, the biggest tragedy of humanity was the moment that we decided that this wasn't how ordinary life is supposed to feel like. That was the moment where we resigned ourselves to grayness. And once you've resigned to grayness, it's just a matter of time before things get dark. That is a real tragedy of humankind. So, what if we didn't? What if we refused to accept defeat? How different would the world be? How different would we feel? Because you see, before, I made fun of how all the gloom and doom was breaking people, but the truth is that we're all living under this, in some form or another. Most of the times without even being fully aware of it, precisely because we've resigned to living in a way that isn't really aligned with what's most meaningful to us. So, what if we made it our duty to truly recapture the spark that lights people up, to help people connect and bring to the world that which makes them feel most alive? I believe not only we'd have very different people, but also a very different world. And now that we have the message, can we build a container that feels as beautiful and full of life as the vision that we're trying to spread? One where we understand aesthetics not just as a marketing tool, but as the ways in which we can experience, in a deeply embodied and intuitive way, all the different colors and textures of the sacred. Because the truth is that, even with meaning articulacy, words can only take you so far. Just think about the feeling of transcendence and reverence that one might feel in a church or temple, or the feeling of empowerment and freedom that Lady Liberty inspires. So, what is the art that will help us make real the full vibrancy of our vision? Can we spread these ideas with videos that have the sensibility of our favorite films? Events with the electricity of the best concerts? Can we revive the art of ritual and put in service to our vision? Can everything we do be understood not just as strategy, but also an artistic gift to the world? Because if other movements aren't doing this, it's not because it's impossible, but because no one cares enough about it. But I do. I care a lot. So this is the movement that we want to build, a movement that is driven by a love for life rather than a fear of death. And I know that given the current world situation, this might feel like a big ask, but I believe the best time for hope is not when it feels the easiest, but when we need it most.